The alcohol in his bloodstream, the soft drone of honeybees in the air, and the hypnotizing warmth of the sun had all combined to make Mike pleasantly drowsy. He lay on his back on the grass beside the blue nylon wall of their tent and stared up at the sky through half-closed eyes. Amber and Louise were lying half in and half out of the tent with their heads and upper bodies on the camp roll and their bare legs and feet sprawled out into the open air. The gentle murmur of their voices added to the general laid-back atmosphere. Adam and Sandy had gone to do a spot of birdwatching, although Mike suspected they were making the most of their child-free weekend to snatch some together time, and Joe was snoring loudly from his and Louise's tent. They had collected a bunch of dried twigs and small branches so they could make a campfire later, and they'd eaten the prepared chicken salad sandwiches that Everfish and Louise had brought along for a shared lunch. The rest of the afternoon stretched languidly out without a single responsibility in sight. "Isn't that right, Mike?" Louise's strident question cut through his daydreaming to rap at his ears. "Ha!" He lifted his head and opened one eye to see her peering out at him from the fly of the tent. "What was that?" "We were just talking about those lost kids. Wild animals would have picked all the flesh from their bones by now, wouldn't they? Nice topic of conversation." He balanced himself up on his elbows as Amber emerged from the tent beside Louise to listen to his reply. "I guess it depends on what happened to them. If they fell into the river, their bones might be tumbling down towards the sea by now." "Bones? You said bones. Which means that fish would have eaten the flesh, and everyone knows that fish are wild and they're also part of the animal kingdom. Which also means that I'm right." Louise grinned triumphantly at Amber. Amber took no notice of her and instead gazed fearfully around the clearing. What sort of wild animals live in this part of the woods? Mike threw Louise a warning look. Amber was reluctant enough about this camping trip as it was. She didn't need Louise filling her head with concerns about what kinds of creatures might be lurking in the bushes. Louise is probably talking about scavengers, the rats and other little critters that scurry around cleaning up the remains of dead bodies. Bugs do a good job of it too. They're nature's housekeepers. There haven't been any mountain lions or any other sort of large animal seen in this part of the forest for years. Too many people around for their liking. Joe snorted and mumbled something in his sleep from the tent on the opposite side of the unlit campfire. As Mike watched, the side of the tent bulged comically in and out as he fought off imaginary foes. A minute or two later, he crawled out of the tent with bleary eyes and madly tousled hair, all long, thin limbs and sharply jutting elbows. Must have fallen asleep. "What's everyone up to?" "We were talking about those missing kids." Louise stood up and stretched her hands high above her head. "Good sleep?" "Yeah." Joe stretched too, yawning widely. "Is there anything to eat?" Louise smiled fondly. She moved closer to her husband and rubbed her hand over his concave belly through his wrinkled t-shirt. "You're always hungry. I'll make you a deal. If you promise to catch me a fish for dinner tonight, I'll find you a snack to eat now." Joe wrapped his arms around her and pulled her against him, giving her a tight squeeze before releasing her again. "I can't promise you a fish, but we'll give it a damn good shot. Mike, do you want to go and toss a line into the river? This time of the afternoon is a good time to give it a try. What are we supposed to do while you're off fishing? It's a boring out here." Amber fussed and grumbled as Mike retrieved his telescopic fishing rod and his tin of spinners and lures from his backpack. "Find a nice spot to sunbathe or read a book," Mike said shortly. For some reason, today he was keenly aware of the difference between his relationship with Amber and the relationships of the other couples. It wasn't the first time he noticed it, of course, but this was the first time he felt such a sense of loss for what might have been. Yes, he loved Amber, but what if he'd chosen someone less moody and more affectionate as his life partner? He couldn't imagine his wife hunkered down like Louise was now, industriously making him cheese and crackers on a plastic plate on the grass so that he could have something to eat before he went fishing. "Looks like I got back at the right time. Are you heading down to the fishing hole?" Adam and Sandy walked into the clearing hand in hand, which only served to heighten Mike's sense of unfairness. Sandy's cheeks were decorated with two high spots of color and the couple kept glancing at each other and smiling as if sharing a secret. He knew exactly what they'd been up to. "Yup." Joe spoke around a mouthful of food. He clapped a battered fishing hat on his head and picked up his rod. "We're going down to get us a succulent brown trout for dinner. You girls will be okay, won't you? There's plenty of wood there if you decide to light the fire while we're gone. Adam had already grabbed his fishing rod. We've got the makings for campfire nachos if you don't catch anything, so no pressure. Sandy planted a smacking kiss on Adam's lips. Get out there and have fun, and I'll see you when you get back. If you play your cards right, I might let you drag me away into the bushes again to make that wilderness sex tape you've been badgering me about for years. Adam gave his wife a lustful wink while Joe snorted with laughter, spraying cracker crumbs onto the grass. Mike looked over at Amber, but she was sullenly kicking at the turf and not paying him any mind. He walked to the edge of the clearing and pretended to check the river from here. If she called out a goodbye or ran over to kiss him, it would make all the difference. Right, let's go, boys. Adam marched past him with his fishing rod in one hand and the trout net in the other. My casting arm is ready to get down to business. Joe was right behind him, scooting around an old dead log that had been turned gray from the impact of the elements, and striding across the stones towards the river. Let's see if Ed was right about this fishing hole. Mike hurried to catch up with the others. He stopped for a moment to look back at the clearing before they headed around the bend, hoping to see Amber standing and watching. If she was there, he would lift his hand and give her a cheerful wave. It would be a simple matter to reconnect them again with that one small, friendly gesture, but there was no one there. The pool that Ed had spoken of was further from the bend in the river than Joe had thought, and he still wasn't exactly sure if this was the right spot, but they'd all agreed that it would do for now. Mike cast out his line once more, doing so easily with arms made strong and sure from his job as a roofer, and slowly wounded in again. Adam and Joe were a short distance away from where he now stood, each man spaced far enough apart so that they weren't encroaching on each other's fishing space but close enough so that they could easily yell out to one another. Mike watched the lure twist and flash through the clear water as he wound in the line. He liked to rely on his gut instinct when he was fishing, and his gut was telling him that this wasn't the right place to catch the hoped-for trout. He wound the lure all the way back up to the top of the rod and moved away from the water's edge. He tramped across the uneven, ankle-wrenching stones to reach Adam, who had just cast out once again. I'm going around the next bend to see what's up there. Adam nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the overhanging branches that were dangling above the water on the other side of the river. I'm staying here. Something big is watching from beneath that overhang over there, waiting for its chance to strike. I can feel it in my bones. Mike looked back down the riverbed at Joe, but he was crouched over his fishing rod, changing lures or untangling a snare in the line and not looking up. Mike nodded at Adam and trudged away across the sand and stones. Some of the stones were closer to the size of boulders and were bleached a pale gray, worn smooth by a ferocious mix of sun and water. They made a gritty, harsh sound beneath the soles of his shoes, although the noise was fighting to be heard over the loud roar and rush of the river at this point. He reached the next bend and continued following the curve of the river until the others were out of sight. There were more rapids here, and shallows, but further up he could see another wider, deeper part and yet more wild rapids. That spot where the rapids gave way to a calmer patch might prove lucky for a lone fisherman. The rhythmic, rasping crunch of the stones beneath his feet and the roar of the river were oddly soothing. He inhaled deeply, taking in the intoxicating scent of wildflowers, pine gum, and fresh air. This was the life. Why didn't they do stuff like this more often? Just pack up and get away from everything, out in the wilderness where the pressures of life cease to exist? He enjoyed his job as a roofer, and he liked having the opportunity to muck around with cars and fix things in his time off, but there was something exquisite about turning his back on all of that and reacquainting himself with nature. Unfortunately, he knew exactly why they didn't do stuff like this more often. Amber was the obstinately entrenched, housebound root beneath that particular issue. Amber didn't like the outdoors, she preferred to stay home, and she wasn't shy about telling him. He'd reached the place where the rapids slowed and widened and he stood for a moment, surveying the river. He was close to the water's edge now, close enough that one more step would have him toppling in. Was this what those young boys had done? Had they come down to the river in search of fun and adventure and somehow fallen in? Those rapids were deceptively fast-moving and there were untold numbers of these deep, mysterious pools along the length and breadth of the McLaren. All it would have taken was for one of the kids to have tumbled in and his friend reaching out to try to assist him before falling in too, both of them screaming for help until the chilly waters silenced their voices forever. A rapidly moving shadow fell across him, coming swiftly from behind, and he looked up expecting to see a solitary cloud drifting across the sun, but the sky was as blue and clear as it had been since they first arrived here. Puzzled, he spun right around to try to pinpoint the source of the shadow and was startled when something large and heavily winged swooped past his head. "Hey!" He ducked and waved his hand wildly in the air as whatever it was circled back and swooped again, whooshing past his ear but moving too fast for him to see it properly in the blinding sunlight. He staggered backwards, tripping over a boulder and failing painfully to his knees on the stones. His fishing rod clattered to the ground and the red and silver lure glinted in the sun just a few feet in front of him. He cautiously raised his head, expecting the territorial hawk or whatever it was to come back for another sweep, but the creature had gone, crashing through the tops of the mid-sized bushes and spindly young trees that grew close to the other shore on this part of the river. "What are you doing down there, Mike?" Adam shouted as he rounded the bend with his rod and net, his laughing voice bouncing across the stones towards him. "Praying for guidance? Praying for luck? You'd be far better off casting your line into the water, but I'm not about to get between a man and his religion." "Ha!" Mike pushed himself to his feet and bent to pick up his fishing rod. He looked over at the bushes where the bird had gone, half expecting it to burst out and come at him again. "I think I disturbed a nesting hawk. It flew out and attacked me. Bit late in the season for nests and fledglings." Adam was closer now and no longer needed to shout. "Are you all right?" "Yeah." Mike glanced down at his sand-speckled knees where they protruded beneath the hem of his cargo shorts. A dark dribble of blood, the result of where he'd connected with a sharp stone when he fell, was making its way slowly down towards his shin. "Where did the bird go?" Adam squinted over at the bushes and saplings that Mike indicated with an annoyed wave of his hand. "Did you say it was a hawk?" "I didn't really see it. I just saw its shadow and then I felt it rush past my head." Mike was done with the bird for now. He turned back to the river, his mind fixed on pulling a fat trout from that pool before Adam beat him to it. It probably was a hawk or an eagle. A bird of prey. Raptors. Adam said knowledgeably. The name comes from the Latin word rapio, which means to seize or take by force. Well, I would have liked to see it try to take me by force. It would have had a fight on its hands if it did. "Hey, I'm just gonna toss a line in over at the end of those rapids." He was already on his way, determined to get there first. "Yeah." Adam remained where he was, staring thoughtfully over into the tangled undergrowth. "Wonder where it went?" They like to perch somewhere with a bit of height. They like to look down on their food source. Mike walked a few steps further upstream, eyeing the river and judging the best place to stop and throw out his line. Something hard crunched and shattered beneath his foot and he looked down, perplexed by the jarring sight of the bright white globe lying amongst the sea of slate-gray stones. Death. What the hell? It's not a human skull, although I can see why you thought it was. It's an animal skull. Maybe a deer or something. Adam picked up the sun-bleached, tooth-filled jawbone that had separated from the skull when Mike stood on it. He held it aloft. "Been here for a while by the looks of it. Does it look like any deer skull I've ever seen?" Mike didn't want to admit it to Adam, but when he first seen it, his immediate thought was that it was the skull of one of the lost boys. The cranium was round and bulging, more human than animal-like in appearance. "You're right." Adam casually kicked at the pieces of broken skull. "Not sure what it is. Might have been easier to identify it if you hadn't smashed it. Look at that high knobby bit. I've never seen an animal head shaped like that." Mike used the end of his fishing rod to point out the protrusion that had caught his eye. Might be some kind of genetic deformity. Bone tumor. The phrase froze on his tongue as soon as he said it, still as deeply painful and sharp as a splash of acid. Why had he said those words now when he'd managed to avoid them for so long? Adam didn't appear to have noticed the way he'd stumbled over the word tumor, and he was still talking about the skull. There was an authorized drop of poison pellets in this area a few years ago. Do you remember? It was supposed to control the rampant rabbit population, but people protesting against it reckoned it caused extreme and unnecessary suffering. They said it would create issues for successive generations. The drop went ahead anyway, and people picketed the mayor's office for weeks afterwards. Got rid of the rabbits though. I don't remember it, Mike said tersely, wanting this conversation to be over and done with. His previous sense of peaceful equilibrium had vanished, and he'd lost all interest in fishing. Malignant, Adam continued obliviously. The experts said the animals that survived the poisoning could end up developing a malignant gene that they could pass on to their offspring. There was also a concern that other critters could access the poison, compounding the problem. For a while there, a few of the crazier protesters were bandying around the idea that the malignant rabbits would turn into a hard-to-kill superbreed. They put posters up on all the telegraph poles and paid high school kids to hand them out on street corners. You must remember it. Vaguely. Mike kept his voice flat and disinterested. He didn't want to talk about any of this. Bone tumor. Kevin's grinning, freckled face loomed in front of him, full of mischief and glowing with that ingrained love of life that he'd never lost, not even during the worst of it. Something thrashed around in the undergrowth of the other side of the river, and both men looked over at the dense cluster of bushes. There was one final crash and the crackle of breaking twigs, and then silence. The raptor has left the building. Adam picked at a couple of the jagged teeth in the jawbone in his hand, attempting to wriggle them out of their bony socket. For all we know, this might be the skull of an enormous deformed rabbit. Wrong sort of teeth. Mike turned his back on Adam and determinedly threw out his line as he tried to tuck the image of Kevin back into that safe place in his mind where he tried to keep it. Kevin had been the little brother he'd always wanted, coming into the world just before Mike's 6th birthday. He doted on the boy, and Kevin had returned his devotion with all the love in his heart. 5 years later, little Kevin was dead from an aggressive and unstoppable form of Ewing's sarcoma, and the Harvard family were packing up what was left of their lives to move out here. The cancer had started in the child's spine and insinuated itself into his lymph nodes and liver before anyone had a chance to work out why he walked with that funny little lopsided gait of his. The doctors were at a loss to explain it, saying that most kids had a good chance of recovery from the disease, but sometimes these things just happened. Not many of Mike's friends knew about Kevin. It wasn't that he wasn't proud of him or anything like that, it was more that talking about him still hurt so damn much, even after all these years. Mike often thought of his life in 3 distinctive parts: 5 years spent waiting for Kevin, 5 years spent loving him, and 20 years spent missing him. The doctors said Ewing's sarcoma wasn't hereditary and it was just one of those things, but Mike's deep-seated fear that he might fall in love with a child of his own only to lose him as he'd lost Kevin was the real reason behind his refusal to consider having a baby with Amber. Amber knew about his past, of course, but he suspected that she thought she might be able to change his mind about parenthood at some stage. And perhaps she might be able to do so one day, but just not right now. Not yet. He just wasn't ready yet. Adam was still talking about what kind of animal the skull might have belonged to when Mike felt the familiar grab and tug of a fish taking the lure. He seized hold of the reel handle and wound it, watching as water droplets sprang off the taut nylon line as the fish battled and fought against him. You got one. Adam was by his side in an instant, the jawbone dropped to the ground and the unidentified skull now forgotten. Let's see what he's made of. A burst of adrenaline surged through Mike's veins, heightening his senses and adding an extra layer of strength to his actions. This was what he'd been looking forward to the most, this fight between man and beast, this wielding of power and might on both ends of the fishing rod, this determination of who would win the battle. He slipped his thoughts of Kevin back into the special spot he kept for him at the back of his mind and turned his entire focus to landing the trout. I've got my net, Adam said excitedly. Bring him in close enough and I'll scoop him up. I have to get him in yet, Mike said through gritted teeth. The fish was a more than worthy opponent and it was taking all his concentration to keep the nylon line taut as he struggled to wind it in and play it out again, one careful inch at a time. The fish took a sudden leap, a silver splash lunging through the rapids before diving back down into the water, and Mike's rush of adrenaline surged again. Adam and his excited chatter faded into the background and nothing mattered but the fishing rod in his hand and the fish on the end of the line. Minutes passed, but Mike was unaware of the sweat on his brow or the strain across his shoulders. The fish was close now, almost close enough for Adam to reach with his net. Mike was only dimly aware of the words he muttered under his breath as he pulled the fish in close to shore. Adam whooped triumphantly and scooped it up in the net. This one's for you, Kevin. This one's for you, baby boy.